Hi guys, welcome everybody to this tribute to the scenario Celso Furtado session. I'm Giuliano Toshiro Yajima, and together with Gabriel Aidar and Florencia Jacud, we are here co-hosting this session, which will pay a tribute to Celso Furtado, which is one of the founding father of Latin American thinking and structuralism in general. And yeah, we decided to pay this tribute and inviting us two economists, namely Esteban Perez Caldentes, who is chief of the Financial Development Unit, and he works at the ECLAC, the Economic Commission for Latin America and Caribbean, where Celso Furtado spent some of this year, and he elaborate part of his intellectual contribution. And also we are here with Monica Meireles, who is Brazilian, but he is a lecturer at the National Autonomous University in Mexico City. And yeah, this is the main aim of this roundtable is to discuss the actuality of the Celso Furtado thinking during pandemic times, and to discuss his contribution either in terms of the old structuralist thinking, and to make a retrospect to what is the new development of the structuralism, or call it the neo-structuralist thinking. So I will first, since Monica was the first to enter in this discussion, I will give the floor to Monica if Esteban has nothing, and also because he's Brazilian, and yeah, and then I will give you the floor to Esteban, and then I'll open for question and comments. So Monica, please, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Giuliano. Thank you, Jonathan and Giuliano, for the invitation, and thank you all the coordinators and organizers of the Latin American Working Group for this very special session. I have prepared a brief text that I would like to start reading, but before that, I have a PowerPoint presentation that summarizes some of the topics that I have in my text. So if you just let me share this. I don't know if are you seeing the presentation? Okay. Okay, that's fine.
That's fine. Yeah.
Okay, so once again, thank you very much for the kind invitation to sharing this space with Professor Caldente and in all the Latin American Working Group. Well, on July 26, we celebrate 100 years since the birth of the Brazilian economist Celso Furtado. The pandemic and the confinement failed to block the path of the vast parade of well-deserved tributes. There was a huge celebration, even through via Zooms. The truth is that there are still a series of academic events that underline the original Furtadian contribution to understanding the intricacies of underdevelopment and dependence that continue to plague our subcontinent. Subcontinent, underdeveloped, a curious choice of words for a reading of the socioeconomic phenomena that do not feel a bit sub or minus concerning the interpretation of other latitudes than Latin America. For those who have not enjoyed the vibrant celebration so far, I strongly recommend looking to the Facebook page of the Celso Furtado International Center for Development Policies, where you will find a rich menu of online activities to savor more calmly the reflection on the work of the honoree. Overall, if we are going to continue feeding the billionaire Mark Zuckerberg with free data with each of our clicks, that is at least for a good cause. A common feature highlighted by countless commentators of Furtado's work is its character that extrapolates purely economic reasoning. More than that, in his multidisciplinary vision of social phenomena, the economic sphere is made up of historical process, always unique and complex process that have settled into a specific economic structure in each country. In this sense, his definition of underdevelopment is not presented as the accurate prelude to the development, but as a special result of the spread of capitalism in areas that had previously been colonial, such as Latin America. That violent encounter ended up characterizing them as hybrid structures, and where different forms of production, distribution, and consumption of the surplus coexist. And this is a quote of Furtado of a book of 1964. At the final part of my presentation, I'm going to share some reference. Countries whose historical legacy inherited such an ugly scar, being in hybrid structure, can become more and more complex in terms of their productive structures, for example, by industrializing themselves. However, industrialization, which has been in American country increasingly dominated by transnational companies that constantly sabotage any possibility of internalization of the decision-making center by national actors, will hardly help them make the quantum leap from being undeveloped countries to becoming developed countries. In short, underdevelopment deepens at each new stage of the economic structural change, and the challenges to overcome it constantly multiplies. Be aware, overcoming overdevelopment is not exactly the same as following in a homogeneous way the footsteps trod by today's developed capitalist countries. Thus, it seemed to me that a true injustice is being committed by the most radical left with Furtado, by wrongly proclaiming that Latin American structuralism would be merely an ingredient in the ideology that was cooked in tune with the interests of the native bourgeois to save peripheral dependent capitalism, and for it to have a kind of human face, whatever a capitalism with a human face is supposed to mean. Something that always surprised me when reading some of his works, Furtado's works, especially from the 70s on, is how the multidisciplinarity of Furtado's thought goes far beyond the aforementioned fusion that places economic analysis at the intersection of history and politics. Since then, since the 70s, and in an increasingly powerful way, the dimension of culture, the appreciation of humanist values and art, and the density of philosophical concern have formed an unexpected filter of light in his already original gaze towards economic problems. Thus, he is capable of stringing economic dependence, cultural indoctrination, and political authoritarism as the most damaging feature of peripheral production systems that are subject to the interests of transnational companies that operate in the Latin American region. I'm sorry. Here we have yet again another curious choice of words, since subjects in the sentence above is read as passive to the action of other. But the same word can be read in a different context as active agent, which is another connotation for the word subject has. All those little turns with the subject of the subject can surely be seen as a wink for those who know Hegel's dialectic of master and slave. And for those who live in Mexico, like me or like us, and have shed more than 1 year accompanied by a good mezcal and listening to Esclavo y Amo, Slave and Master, a song by Javier Solís. Economic dependence and political authoritarianism are more intuitive elements to understand, but it's worth giving a brief example of cultural indoctrination. Our elites, who are ecstatic at the latest trend of purely commercial type of contemporary art sold at hipster galleries, and simultaneously they frown their nose to indigenous folks art. For them, our elites, Damien Hirst is posh and synonymous of fine art. And they, once again, our elites, qualify as naco or trashy, everything that brings the aura of their people. By the way, there as a possession and not as in the sense of recognizing themselves as also belonging to the same something, since the Latin American elite wants what is to differentiate oneself or themselves from the plebeians that happens to be their fellow nationals. We can attest to what we have stated above, and at the same time, and without contradicting ourselves, recognize that knowledge, art, and creativity as the action that promote the liberation of the human being are not very familiar with frontiers and passports. We also venture to say that the truly liberating breeding we also venture to say that the truly liberating breeding ground, which mixes science, culture, and the formation of critical consciousness, has little to do with, for example, militant art. That type of expression that forces the hand to send a certain political message and abandons an artistic ambition along the way. In short, printing the semblance of an authoritarian and misogynist guerrillas leader from the past, no matter how vibrant colors are used on cool little t-shirts, does not mean anything for the formation of conscience, since the reverse of rationalism always generated strong impulses towards idolatry. And this is a quotation from Furtado, 7 and 9. On the special way of steering path between science, art, and liberation, I'm so amazed that Furtado, by continually enriching his interpretative kaleidoscope, is one of the few economists who can coherently combine the rigorous analysis of the structural conditioning factors of peripheral economies with themes so deep and inherent to the human condition. It's not by chance that he is the one of the few fellow members of our peculiar syndicate of economists who could write something like, and now I'm reading another quotation from Furtado, opening quotation marks here, art that does not become an object constitutes the expression of a form of a pure freedom. Thus, once again, I'm sorry. So Furtado, this is Furtado words. Art that does not become an object constitutes the expression of a form of pure freedom. Thus, authentic dance was always conceived as a form of bodily liberation in a civilization in which everything is subject to the logic of the media. Could here be a more revolutionary message than merging creating with being alive? And I'm closing quotation marks. Furtado, 7 and 9, page 2021. To end this point about the special way in which Furtado looks at the Latin American economy structure, a smaller note. It was recently announced that Kamala Harris will be the one who will accompany Joe Biden as the candidate for vice president on the Democrat ballot in the US presidential elections on November 3rd. And now she is the very vice president-elect. Because of those coincidences in life and the turns the world takes, Kamala Harris' father, Donald Harris, a Jamaican economist who immigrated to the United States, wrote in 1966 a review of Furtado's book, Diagnosis of the Brazilian Crisis, a book from a year before, 1965, in which he points out that it's a research that offers a broad perspective and that encompasses social, political, historical, and economic dimensions to explain the causes of the political crisis in Brazil from before the military coup in 1964. In this review, Harry Sr. points out that Furtado makes inventive use of the dialectical method so that his analysis of contemporary underdeveloped economies responds to the historical process that they have undergone, and where the result has been the creation of structural dualism, whose peculiarities distinguish these economies as a special case within capitalist evolution. It only remains for us to hope that the future holds for us more than this kind of curious coincidences between the framework of the high spheres of political power and the most critical reflection on the economical social reality that we have to live. Knock on wood. I would like to end by telling a bit about Furtado's odd relationship with Mexico. His longest stay in the country occurred between years 1955 and 1957, when he was in charge, together with Juan Loyola Vázquez, a prominent Mexican economist and his friend, of a controversial study by the Economic Commission for Latin America and the Caribbean, ECLEC, on the external sector and the Mexican economy, which after its completion did not meet the light of the day, due to a clear act of censorship jointly by Mexican government and the senior management of the institution. Furtado himself tells us that his relationship with the high command of ECLAC was on its last leg, to put it mildly, and that when he was appointed to direct the mentioned study, due to a series of previous frictions with the management of the organization, the coordination of the project would give him time to prepare a orderly withdrawal from ECLAC. And these are Furtado words as well. Another detail that we cannot miss: he arrives in the country by land after buying a second-hand car in New York and coming down south on an authentic family road trip that, unfortunately, it would be difficult to reproduce with the same tranquility in our days due to the risks that involves the road trip through northern Mexico currently. On the famous ghost text, this text of 57, Arturo Guillén, in an article published in 2017, examines the conjugation, reinforcement, and strengthening of the hypothesis developed by Loyola about the structural nature of the external imbalances, and by Furtado about underdevelopment as a historical feature of the development of capitalism in the periphery. This interweaving of concerns is present in the report titled The External Disequilibrium in Latin American Economic Development, the Case of Mexico, the aforementioned document, which Guillén describes as transcendental in the structuralist theory of development, as it is extensive and careful of the main macroeconomic variables, global supply and demand of the Mexican economy in the period. Besides, Guillén continues, this study allowed both of them, Furtado and Loyola, to advance in the understanding of underdevelopment, move from the study of the limits of the primary exporter model and the need for industrialization and inward development, which were the themes founding principles exposed in the 48 Prebish's manifesto, to understand the contradictions and barriers of the import substitution model. Unfortunately, due to the extra court causes mentioned, the work was not published at the time. Finally, perhaps here we did not need to touch the well-worn keys of the significance of Furtado's contribution. Perhaps it will not have been necessary to go into the details of some of his texts. Perhaps we would only have stayed with Furtado at his Mexican party to commemorate him properly, as in Mexico we celebrate on November 2nd those who was physically left but never ever really left us, with plenty of alcohol, delicious food, and the unmistakable joy of meeting good friends. But what would life be like without the bad decisions that are also part of what hammers down our trajectory? And thank you very much. Thank you very much for your attention.
No, we thank you, Monica, for this nice and very interesting and really deep retrospective on Celso Furtado, and also thanks for your words on and your insights on his connection between Mexico and with Mexico and his figure. So now I will leave the floor to Esteban Perez.
Thank you very much. I'm going to share a PowerPoint presentation. Okay. I'm going to be talking, providing some thoughts on Raúl Prebisch, Celso Furtado, and their contribution to structuralism, neo-structuralism, trying to show why their contribution is so important to the current juncture in which the world finds itself and the current situation. I would begin talking about the practice of development economics, and to begin with a quote from Agenor and Montiel, their book on development macroeconomics from 1996. And the idea to show this quote is to argue that the practice of development economics has been influenced by the belief that developing economies are no different than developed economies. Indeed, Agenor and Montiel, in this quote, they say, true, developing economies have market structures and institutions that fundamentally affect the way macroeconomic policies work. And these may, in fact, make them different, yet giving into the notion that they are different throws overboard a vast amount of knowledge and experience that could be brought to bear on solving real problems. The battle cry, this country is different, is ultimately a scoundrel's plea for protecting outdated interpretations or politicized policy advice from intellectual import competition. And this has been the point of view of neoclassical economics regarding developing economics for a very long time. If you read the second edition of Meyer's Pioneers in Development, that includes Celso Furtado, the first edition included Prebisch, and you go to the comments that were provided by Chilean central banker, basically the comments of the criticism was that Furtado was basically justifying through his views import protection and outdated views with respect to developing countries. So this belief had important consequences for both development theory and for development practice. This led eventually to the suppression of all of structuralism and the different points of view of both Prebisch and Furtado, to say that they were outdated, to the complete dominance of mainstream economics and the marginalization of alternative approaches, to the adoption of free market-oriented policies and the categorization of developmental policies as market distortion, and into initiatives to level the playing field in the sense that developing economies have to be as open as developed economies. And that's meant leveling the playing field, which has basically left developing economies without policy instruments that were essential to the whole structuralist view. If you read, for example, Furtado, when he talked about the burning of stocks of coffee in order to contract their demand to improve the price, when he talks about increasing demand, those were instruments that developing economies had at their disposal to promote growth, to promote development. The same idea with industrial policy, with structuralism or market intervention. When Joseph Loeb says the following quote about structuralism and about more than structuralism, about government intervention and perhaps a development strategy guided by the state, he says that kind of strategy was a practice before it was a policy, and a policy before it was a theory. And a lot of what the structuralism, the theory was meant to be, a lot of what it did, both coming from Prebisch and from Furtado, was to try to rationalize a practice that countries already had adopted in Latin America, especially the bigger economies, like the economies of Brazil. As if we look at the work of Celso Furtado, and using the entry on the Palgrave Dictionary of Economics and his work, we can classify his contributions in 4 different areas: structuralism and economic history, and there I put one reference, economic formation of Brazil; the concept of economic underdevelopment, development and underdevelopment, a structural view of the problems of development and underdeveloped countries; foreign trade and dependency, the myth of economic development, accumulation and development. But there's also another category that people just tend to forget, and that is later writings on the contribution to global capitalism, in his books Global Capitalism and In Search of a New Model, where he characterized this new capitalism, which was basically financialized, which was basically with a high concentration of income, and which was eventually very where developed countries just follow the patterns of consumption developing countries of developed countries, and where basically they had really no instruments or very few instruments and little policy to foster the process of economic growth and economic economic development. And I would like to show some stylized facts, I think, that reflect what Celso Furtado thought about global capitalism. The first is this: a stagnation at the global level. These are 3 graphs that show, first of all, world GDP growth rate. The second shows the trade volume growth rate. And the third is the rate of growth of real fixed investment. That's at the global level. If you look to Latin America, this is what we have in Latin America. And you can see, for example, that around here, in the early 50s, the early 70s, the rates of growth were 50.4 between 51, 57, 50.2 between 58, 64, 65, 75, 5.7. And since then, you've seen sort of a decline in the rate of growth. The latest is 2.14, 20 to 2020, which is 0.5. And now with the pandemic, it's even worse. That was before the pandemic. And really, this graph can be looked at in this way when you have sort of the trend rate of growth in Latin America from 1969 to 2021, and you see both in terms of GDP per capita and both in terms of GDP growth, a decline in the rates of growth. These figures are figures that are calculated by taking 10 years, then adding another year, and each point you add another year till you arrive at 2019. And 2019 therefore reveals the entire history. You add history as you go along, and obviously here you will see a vertical line that shows the debt crisis of the 1980s, and thereafter the permanent decline of Latin America. But besides this decline in the rate of growth, which was, from my point of view, foreseen by structural thinkers, including Celso Furtado, you also have this, which is the increased number of financial crises. This shows the number of financial crises in the world that increases from 28, 1970, 1979 to 114, 80, 89, 258, 90, 99 to 2000, 2000 to 87 during 2000, 2017. And if you look further, then you will see that those crises, including the crises that have taken place in Latin America, have become more systemic. So not only do you have lower growth in the world, not only do you have lower growth in Latin America, you have greater financialization, and therefore a greater possibility or probability of financial crisis. And lastly, the third pillar of this model of development that Furtado talked about is this: greater inequality. And this graph shows the evolution of the wage share for Latin America, for South America, and for Central America and Mexico between 1970 and 2015. In all cases, this has declined. And when we talk about the wage share here, for example, for Latin America, which is about 37%, the rest is just profits. It's accumulation of profits. It's the model of development. If you look at the case of Chile, which I have done some work on it more specifically, you realize that this is the rate of profit, and this is in logarithms, really has increased since the 2000s, and is really reached in 2011 what the rate of profit was in 2000 in the Pinochet era in the 1980s. And those, I think, are what characterizes the model of development. And that's the fear that structuralist thinkers had regarding to the evolution of what this idea that Furtado called global capitalism. He says, regarding to finance, no one can ignore the fantastic concentration of power in the so-called financial markets, dominated by exchange rate speculation. The distribution of income in the world depends on the virtual operations of the financial sector. So you have this. This idea of greater financialization. You find this idea, even if it's incipient. You have this idea of greater concentration of income, and with it, you have a decline in the rate of growth, permanent decline. And this is the idea that you find in the world, but especially in developed economies. And this is, I think, the world or the situation, the scenario that structuralist economists and those economists working at ECLA at that time wanted to avoid. And this is why Prebisch had the manifesto. And this is why Furtado wrote about Prebisch's manifesto. When I read it, I understood that we needed autonomous theoretical work that started from our own Latin American reality. Without autonomy to theorize in the field of the social sciences, we are reduced to simple, sterile mimicry. And that, I think, is essential. I tend to think that the structuralist authors, and even Furtado in his one of his last books about his books about a new political economy, did not go far enough because they missed one thing that's present in post-Keynesian economics that is not present in structuralist economics: the determination of the rate of output by forces other than supply and demand. And that, I think, it's essential. Structuralists saw very well, and Furtado saw this in an article he wrote in 1952, that the difference between developed countries and developing countries was an issue of composition. You increase demand, like Keynes said, but you have to take into account the elasticities of supply and how supply responds to that demand, how supply responds to effective stimulation on the part of demand. And one can think about the pandemic and how the pandemic has destroyed productive capacity, how the pandemic has destroyed structures that were there, and thus it is naive to think, for example, using Furtado's 1952 article criticizing Norsk and other development thinkers that development was just about increasing investment, that a counter fiscal policy can just increase investment without taking account the destruction that has occurred in the productive sphere. Because one cannot think that an increase in investment and that the productive capacity will respond in the same way prior to the pandemic than after the pandemic. And I think that's a crucial insight of structuralist authors. I would like to go a little bit into the structuralist school. So as Furtado said, it was time to think differently. We couldn't just do what Agenor and Montiel suggest, that developing countries are no different, and that's an excuse basically for undertaking protectionist policies. The structuralist school is the only effort of creation of a body of thought on economic policy that has emerged in the developing world. This is a quote from Furtado. And it was articulated in the 1950s and 1960s by all of these structuralists, that includes Celso Furtado and all the rest, including Osvaldo Zunca, who is still alive, William Arthur Lewis, Juan Noyola, and the like. And by the way, the word structuralism came up during the debate in the 1960s that the monetarists and the structuralists had regarding inflation, which the basic argument about the structuralism is that you cannot think that inflation is a purely monetary phenomenon. The monetarists do that because they have the quantity theory of money, and behind the quantity theory of money, they have something else that people don't mention very much, but is very important: the determination of the full employment level by the real forces, by productivity, by preferences and technology. And that's what the difference, therefore, in the view of inflation, rather than a monetary phenomenon, really resides in the differences regarding how you determine the real level of output. And in that sense, monetarism is as real as structuralism, because ultimately the monetary presuppositions and the monetary policies and recommendations derive from the determination of the level of real output, which is the main essential variable in the quantity theory, and the structuralists the same. Although structuralists failed, I think, in trying to put forward an analytical theory that would rival the monetarist theory, but that's what where structuralism was how the concept was born, essentially. Structuralists focused on the following issues: the power of dependency, organizing the center-periphery duality, the criticism of the law of comparative advantage, and this is in the work of Furtado, and this is in the work of Prebisch, the dual character of economic development, the existence of an unlimited supply of work, this is more Arthur Lewis, the need for stated guided development, I think that's in Furtado, his examples of Brazil, his examples, for example, in Brazil of how inflation had real effects in terms of accumulation and in investment. Actually, if you read Keynes also in 1930 in his treatise on money, he says exactly the same thing. And in the tract on monetary reform, that he wrote in 1923, when he says inflation is important because of the different effects it has on different social classes, on workers, on rentiers, and on capitalism. And so inflation is in essence an economic problem. And Furtado, when he talked about how inflation affected Brazil, how it changed the social classes in Brazil, how it improved investment, he was looking at the real factors of inflation. The last is the need for integration into the regional and international economy to overcome the problem of development, which is quite present in the last works of Furtado, which is In Search of a New Model, Reflections on the Contemporary Crisis, and Global Capitalism. Neo-structuralist, which I'm going to go a little bit into neo-structuralist, has developed on the subjects and concerns that are the guardian of structuralism, but with a more refined approach. You have changing production patterns with social equality, development from within, etc. And it represents an effort to integrate into structuralist thought the changes that occurred in the region internationally from the 1980s. And actually, those are the ones that Furtado mentioned in his last works on a new model of development, and also in global capitalism, the balance of payments regulation, capital account regulation, international finance, trade, and the like. As I said before, structuralism was developed from the analysis and study of reality. And this is, I think, something that Furtado did very rigorously, is that you had to look at historical patterns before you can theorize. And this is what the quote that I mentioned before: structuralism was a practice before it was a policy, and a policy before it was a theory. It was an issue of theorizing what was really happening in Latin America. In that sense, ECLAC and the whole group of structuralist thinkers are not to be credited with influencing industrialization, but rather the opposite. It was the practice of industrialization that influenced their thinking. A crucial point pointed by Furtado, and essentially before that Prebisch, was that development takes place within a system of international relations. And this is the whole idea of center and periphery. And the idea of center and periphery, which is an idea that Prebisch started to coin in the 1920s, when he was working with the economic cycle of Argentina, but really became separate and individual and more refined concepts in 1946, when he analyzed what were that Latin American economies could not have a cycle on their own, that the cycles were generally from the outside, that he didn't know, Prebisch would say, one single historical episode when a cycle was produced by the internal forces, or produced by the external forces. And he called the United States the cyclical center because it was the most important economy back then. It was at that time also that Prebisch, and I think this is also in the work of Furtado, said that and this foresaw a little bit the asymmetry that we have today, for example, in responding to the pandemic, when developed countries can have counter-cyclical policies that amount to about $11 trillion. This is not the case in developing economies. In developing economies, there are giant debt, and eventually you will have international organizations telling them to adjust. Prebisch at that time in 1946 would say developed countries can just increase money supply without regard to their parities, to their exchange rate parities. But in the periphery, we can't do that. We can't just increase and do quantitative easing, United States Federal Reserve style. We cannot do that. And that's why we impose, for example, controls. And we have to look for other types of instruments. And Prebisch would say, I hate controls, but we have no other alternative. So the idea that the system of international relations was characterized by this idea of the dichotomy of center-periphery, and I think this is one of the things that Furtado, even though sometimes Furtado and Prebisch would not agree on certain issues, and perhaps this is why Furtado eventually left ECLAC, he will recognize that this is one of the major developments or contributions of Prebisch to economic development, the divide between center-periphery, the asymmetry of power, the asymmetry and independence to carry out policy, and what it meant in terms of, for example, of technological progress, which I have a quote right here that I would like to show. Have it somewhere. He said this global vision of the capitalist economy allowed to identify a structural fracture generated by the slow propagation of technological progress and perpetuated by the international division of labor, which is without doubt the most important theoretical contribution of Prebisch, this idea of center-periphery. And this quote from Prebisch where he says, I believe that the cyclical movement is universal, that there is only one single movement which spreads from country to country. It is not one cycle in the United States and a different cycle in each of the countries on the periphery. It is all a single movement divided into very different phases, but with markedly different characteristics depending on whether it is a question of the cyclical center or the periphery. For this reason, although the process is a single one, its manifestations differ depending on where we are situated. And one has to see this idea of the center periphery as a dynamic idea. And if you read some of the writings at the time when the center periphery dichotomy was coined, well, you will see that there were a lot of writings talking about regional disparities, that the center periphery not only could apply to the United States and the periphery, not that China was a part of the periphery, but today China could be thought of as being part of the center because there's a different configurations, and the configurations of power among regions and influence change over time. And the notion of growth also served, the idea of center periphery served to try to analyze these ideas of how can we determine long-term growth. And when you think about the idea of a balance of payment constraint, which actually one of the structuralists, which is Octavio Rodriguez, coined in an article, in a footnote to an article in the ECLAC Review in 1976, which was in Prebisch's mind also, I think, in terms of in Furtado, they were antecedents to the balance of payments constraint growth. The idea that center periphery means not only of the idea relating to the real sector, that there's slow technological progress, that technological progress stays in the center, that it doesn't get channeled to developing countries, but it also has to do with the reserve currency. And this is an idea that was not completely explicit in these structural authors, but one can derive this idea from their writings, from their thought. It is very strange if you start thinking about reserve currencies that the United States dollar, for example, gained strength during the global financial crisis. I've seen no country in the world except the United States that has strengthened their currency due to a financial crisis. It's very odd. Today, the dollar has become even more important. And all the interventions, for example, the swap interventions of the Federal Reserve are basically to protect American interests and actually to increase the strength of the dollar, to make this asymmetry between center and periphery greater. And this idea that countries cannot issue their reserve currency is at the basis of the balance of payments constraint, although it's real. Because you cannot issue that currency, you have to earn that currency in order to import your goods. And the only way to earn that currency is either you get in debt, which you cannot, either you count on foreign direct investment, or you simply have to export more. So countries face this external constraint, and if you think about this external constraint, about the last bullet that I have about when their performance in external markets and the response of the financial markets to this performance, the limit and restricts their scope for conducting domestic policies, including fiscal, exchange rate, and monetary policies, you can think about the pandemic. You can think when capital just left the countries, the developing countries, because they had too much risk. That's an external constraint. And that's why it's so important to have instruments and a strategy of development that's completely different. As I said before, technical progress has played a central role in the development of a neo-structuralist thought. And this was at the basis also of previous distinctions between center and periphery. And obviously, technical progress leads to this issue of industrial policy that's so prevalent in previous writings, but you can see it also in Furtado's writing: the need to plan, the need to industrialize countries, the need to create, for example, a core, as Feinsilber would say, of entrepreneurs that can lead this this progress. So if you look at Furtado, you look at Prebisch, and you look at other thinkers, I think there's a clear line of thought between the centrality of income distribution. That's another thing that you have in structuralists, and you have also in neo-structuralists, and you have also in Prebisch, and you have also in Furtado. And this is the idea that the capital accumulation historically improved income distribution and living standards in the most developed economies because they led to higher wages. But in the developing economies, the opposite occurred. You have accumulation did not lead to the transformation of social structures. And this idea, the idea, for example, of Furtado, when he talks about the cultural dimension of development, this idea that we have to simply mimic the consumption habits of developed countries is implicit in this idea of income distribution that's linked, obviously, to technological progress. And it's this idea of income distribution plus the slow transmission of technological progress that was, I think, important in arriving at two central concepts, which is the structural heterogeneity and social heterogeneity. And these are still very important. What do I mean, for example, by structural heterogeneity? I was just now in another commenting some papers by ISI students. When you look, for example, at the concentration of power in terms of firms, in terms of investment, you'll see structural heterogeneity. In ECLAC, we did some exercise trying to see who invests. Because you can't say that in developing countries, investment corresponds to the same type of modeling as in developed countries, or you have a lot of firms that invest. Actually, the bulk of investment actually resides in very few firms, and that's structural heterogeneity. Today, for example, you have, and this is why it's so important, even for the pandemic and even for development, investment and output are divorced from the creation of employment. When one reads, for example, the general theory, and Keynes talked in chapter 3 about aggregate demand and aggregate supply, and he talked about employment, and then in the second section where he talks about choice of units and expectations and all the like, well, he says, you know, employment goes with income, they go together. So when I talked about increasing employment, that's what the general theory is, because the general theory of employment, then income increases together. Well, that's not the case anymore in Latin America, because you may have firms that invest and income goes, but underemployment and unemployment go in another direction. And that leads eventually perhaps to try to get but to try to design policies so we can unite the creation of investment to the creation of employment, or policies that are different. Well, one is a policy for investment, and then one is a policy for the creation of employment. I think this is important. Finally, the issue of volatility and instability. And this is an issue that's present in Prebisch. I think it's an issue, as I said before, that was present also in Furtado, and that's why it's so important. What do we do about volatility and instability that are crucial to these economies? When you look at the graph I showed in terms in the Latin American growth, it's extremely volatile. It's extremely volatile with two giant crises in the 1980s, in 2009. Here, a bunch of crises. You have the Asian crisis, the Brazilian crisis, the tequila crisis in 1995. Here, the Brazilian Russian crisis, and you have the Argentine crisis. Then you have the global crisis. Now you have the pandemic. This is volatility. This is instability. And that was at the core, I think, and sometimes it's not highlighted with sufficient force, I think, in structuralist thinkers, including Furtado. But I think the volatility and instability and the importance of trying to understand what the cycle is essential. If you look, for example, at the latest projections of the International Monetary Fund in the World Economic Outlook for October 2020, you see two things about Latin America that really highlight the difference between Latin America and the rest of the economies, and that really calls one attention. Latin America will have the worst contraction of any developing region as a result of the pandemic, and not only 9%, 9%, you know, all the with the independence of the international organizations that have made the projections around there, 8-9%. None of the other regions have that much. And moreover, if you look at their database, you go to the Excel, which is available, it will have the most tenuous recovery of all the regions. Is that particular to Latin America? Is Latin America, does it have a different cycle? Does it have a different behavior than the other regions? Why is this? Is it because Latin America was already growing? Is it because of the structural characteristics of some of the economies that are service-based, Caribbean, for example, tourism, and the pandemic has really affected those retail, etc., informality? Or what is it that makes, and that those questions are, I think, the type of questions that structural authors were trying to highlight. Finally, I would like to end with the issue of commodities, which have been a very important issue in Latin America, that were also at the basis of the Prebisch, at the basis of Furtado. You have to improve, you have to have industrial policy, you have to improve your productive base, you have to improve your export base. And I think commodities, not only the reprimarization of Latin American economies, the fact that commodities in a way and the volatility in prices have to a certain extent prevented industrialization of these economies. Commodities are very tied to financial sector too. So if you have these three sort of characteristics, I think, of the current development model: declining growth, increasing volatility, crisis, but the fact of financialization, and behind it is increasing debt. Latin America is a region that's highly indebted, and not only the public sector, but the private sector. Some of the economies are highly indebted. And the third pillar is a very unequal distribution of income. And this was the development model, I think, that structuralists were trying to avoid. And if you look at some of the structural, some of the productive base, was the productive base sometimes is either tied to inequality, like commodities, because profits have increased. It's tied to lower growth, because when you become concentrated in commodities, you do not diversify the rest of your, for example, manufacturing base. And it's tied to financialization and volatility. These three areas, these three concerns, I think that you have either find explicitly or implicitly in the structuralist authors, including Celso Furtado. And I think this is why they are so relevant to understand today's Latin America's current and perhaps future economic performance. Thank you very much.
So thank you, Esteban, for your very insightful and again interesting speech, and also thank you, Monica, for also your previous intervention. So I will now open the floor to questions and comments for the public. I will also remind you that we'll accept questions from the comments bar. I will try to summarize or even if you are willing to intervene by either raising your hand or unmuting your microphone, they will also be accepted. And before to start, I will try to break the ice by posing a question both to Monica and to Esteban. In particular, with respect Celso Furtado and also the structuralism authors, and how in particular they see the one particular component of their analysis, and that this, namely this the analysis of the evolution of the reproductive structure of Latin American in the aftermath of the 1929 crisis. And so, in particular, also in Celso Furtado and both in Celso Furtado and in structuralist authors, they did analyze this period, and they did say that this was a huge in a way also similar to this current crisis, because there was a huge drop in they had to rethink the developmentalist model, who was at that time hugely export oriented. And then it was they actually recognized that this was actually a trigger for them to furtherly develop their manufacturing sector. And so my question will be both for Monica and Esteban. Do you see this similar window of opportunity in this current situation, or do you think that, given also the insight that Esteban in particular has gave us, it will be not feasible to reproduce such a strategy? So I think we can start with Monica and then with Esteban.
Okay, thank you very much for your question, Giuliano. I think, as Professor Caldenteni was explaining, the 1929 crisis and the need of maintain the national's economies functioning at this moment was a very important impulse to the industrialization process that was already in progress by the time. So if you think about the industrialization here in Mexico, we are talking about a phenomenon that began in the 19th century. So, but as the main motor of the capital accumulation, of course, that after the crisis of 29 and the 30s, the Great Depression was a source of stimulation to keep in this way. the industrialization of the periphery. So I think that this is economic history. But when we talk about the ECLAC contribution, is the ability to see this process and then theorize about the process, make the case for the industrialization of the periphery. So and this is the thing, what is happening in the reality, and the ability of the economist or the social thinker to look at this reality and then try to make sense of it. And what is happening now and what has happened since the 2007-2008 crisis is that we have serious crisis that is like a window of opportunity once again to think about the reality with this opportunity. I'm thinking about when you Julian, when you start to ask your question, I was thinking about this book by Philip Mirovsky, never let a serious crisis being I forgot the whole title, but never let a serious crisis not be analyzed as a serious crisis and properly. So I think we have this opportunity of once again look to the economic structure of Latin America, what is happening right now. And I have the Mexican case very, very much present. The informality sector in our labor market is huge. So all the informal workers are suffering really heavy with the pandemics, and the Mexico government is very timid in this kind of policy to somehow guarantee the flow of money to these workers. So I think that this is the main thing. The main thing that we have to be worried about, and another thing concerning to Furtado, in the same sense, is that Furtado has a piece of work to young students of economics, and in this article, he said. Imagination, creativity, imagination, and the ability to look to the most important aspects, the essential aspects of the reality. This is the capacity of observation and creative imagination to think about it is the main two tools that any student of economics should care about. So I think that this is part of how I would answer your question. Thank you, Juliana, once again.
Yeah, okay, Juliana, just one question. You're talking about the 1980s or 1920s crisis?
Sorry, 1929 crisis.
Okay, okay. The 1929, the Great Depression, had a very significant effect on both Furtado and Prebisch. I'm going to read a small paragraph from Furtado on the 1929 crisis and the response of the Brazilian authorities in the early 1930s to crisis. He says it is true that no one saw that in accumulating and burning mountains of coffee, Brazil was constructing the pyramids that years later Keynes would recommend as a remedy of in the last instance to overcome the Great Depression. This policy of creation of effective demand was not adopted consciously by the Brazilian government. It was a subproduct of the measures taken by under the pressure of the powerful interests of coffee producers. But this is one of the effects of the Great Depression, the discovery of the importance of effective demand. And I think that's very important. And you find the same thing in Prebisch. Prebisch, I think, changed completely with the 1930s depression. It was only during with the 1930s depression and with the effects of the 1930s depression that he began to think about counter-cyclical policy. And the ultimate writer of the definitive writings he has about counter-cyclical policy is this idea that you have to increase internal demand. And I think that's a similar quotation you would find in similar idea you would find in Furtado, that these countries grow through internal demand. In Prebisch, you would have that these countries would grow internal demand, but that meant that you had to, in a way, isolate the economy from external fluctuations. And hence the idea of having exchange rate of capital controls, which was at that time a very common policy recommendation. And Prebisch had a original way of proposing capital controls. I think that's the key. That's two keys, policy prescriptions for the Great Depression. Internal policy, isolate the economy from external fluctuations. You look at today, you have something similar. Because today, for example, the state, due to the pandemic, has become a much more interventionist state. Things that about 10 years ago were unthinkable and were thought to be the product of demented left-wing economies, such as a universal basic income, today are on the table as realistic policy prescriptions to increase demand. Also, you have ideas floating around, and some of them have already been implemented, about central bank intervention and central bank support to fiscal policy. You have the idea that fiscal policy should be basically the tool to increase demand, and that increasing demand is necessary. You have the idea that countries today should have some type of intervention. They don't call it capital controls, but you have some type of capital management. You have exchange rate interventions, and you have central banks that are really interventions. We're going back to the central banks that intervene in the economy, something that was not seen from a long time ago. The danger is that those initiatives, they just that they will be lost if you have increasing debt, and that for me is the great danger of in these economies. I think, because I think a lot of countries are already under the distress, including in Latin America. But all these ideas of the Great Depression, and remember this led, for example, to all the missions that were very different than the camera banks of the United States Federal Reserve that Robert Triffin was leading, that was to change the organization and the functioning of central banks in some countries in Latin America and make them much more friendly to economic development. Thank you.
Oh, thanks to both of you. And then, yeah, I will just open the floor for questions. And again, we do have some question from the comments, but again, feel free to intervene or to either to raise your hand and or to, I don't know, unmute your microphone. So Aldo Alvarez, I believe is more a question for Monica, but of course, Esteban, if you have something to say about that, please. So he said, I have a question for Monica. Did Furtado have other economic influence beside Hegel, philosophical influences? So I don't know if we can collect. We do a first round of question maybe. If there are other questions, then we can either Monica or Esteban can respond.
So Juliana, should we wait for another questions, or can I get this one?
Let's wait a bit more, and maybe for other questions. Other people are typing their question.
I have a question. Can I?
Yeah, go.
Thanks, Monica and Esteban, for your presentation. I have a simple question to state, but I imagine that the answer is far more complicated, but I just wanted to hear a little bit from you. Furtado left us, unfortunately, before the emergence of China as one of the biggest economy in the globe, and before the low interest rates in advanced economies such as we have, since the financial crisis, let's say. So, in your opinion, what would Furtado could say about these two important components of the international economy today, and how to use the structuralism to assess these two issues? Thank you.
Yeah, Monica, I think in the meantime, you can just go and then maybe some.
Okay, thank you, Juliano, and thank you, Aldo, for your question. Let me start answering that with a reflection made by Francisco de Oliveira, a Brazilian sociologist who used to work with Furtado at the SUDENE, the Superintendência para Desenvolvimento do Nordeste, very special regional development bank for the development of the Northwest region of Brazil. And what Francisco de Oliveira said about this, the philosophical influences, and not only philosophical, but the academic or general influence that Furtado has had. And Francisco de Oliveira points out at least three major streams of thought and authors that influence Furtado. One of them is positivism, but not any positivism, but the Auguste Comte positivism. So we can see in the Furtado's work this phase in science. Another branch of influence could be pointed out as the American sociology. So Furtado is somebody who is very much interested in the Wright Mills texts and the power of reality and this kind of discussion, as well as the work in Brazilian by authors who has the same way of thinking our elites. So mainly Casagrande Senzala and Gilberto Freire works. This is the second line of influences that Furtado in somehow absorb and work, deglutates, and something completely new. And the third line of influences that Furtado has is the Marxism, but is is Marx, the work of Marx itself, the theories of imperialism in the Marx followers, as even Lenin. So we can see the way of thinking external sector which is a vocabulary much more light to say the influences of the hegemony and the geopolitics in a specific moment. This is in some sense influenced by the Marxist literature on imperialism, but in a much more refined way, the Marxism getting the Furtado's work, in which is in the work of Karl Mannheim. So Mannheim and all the Frankfurt School of Thought, or School of Philosophy of Thought, is very much important to Furtado. In Mannheim, with two main discussions of Mannheim that we can see in somehow present in the Furtado worries. One of them is the democratic planification, this idea of deepening democracy and thinking about a development strategy headed by the state. It's a way of promoting the radical social, economic, and political transformation of our societies. So this idea of democratic planification of Mannheim is important for the political view of Furtado. And another idea that comes from Mannheim, which is the power of the intellectuals, the knowledge, sociology. So he is very much a fan of this part of Mannheim work as well, the dialectics of knowledge. So I think that with these three main influences, we can understand a little bit more what was happening in the head of Furtado. Thank you.
Okay, I'll answer. The first question is whether the economic influences of Furtado. I think Furtado had influences on some post-Keynesian economies, like Kaldor, for example. I mean, one must not forget that Kaldor, a lot of the growth theories of Kaldor were developed when Kaldor was in Latin America, and he gave several seminars in Brazil. So I think he is influenced by there's a clear direction of influence right there, I think. Okay. The second question with regard to China, in his view of the new capitalism that I mentioned, global capitalism, Furtado mentions the case of China, and he mentions how, without doubt, it is the nations of the East, China in particular, that would to which it corresponds to mark the path of the new series of transformation that will redefine the face of the earth. So he was there. I don't know if he got into very detailed things about China, but certainly that was one of these ideas that, in the same way that, you know, during the 1960s, the 1970s, and the 1930s, there were clear transformations. Capitalism had a clear transformation. What he didn't see, it seems to me, is that countries like the United States will continue to rule because of globalization. And I think that's a very important thing, and has to do with center periphery. Because it's true, some people say, for example, that the United States has those manufacturing power, blah, 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 blah. But this is at the residence level. Inside the United States, a lot of firms are multinationals that produce all over. And many other firms actually that produce in China are firms that are foreign owned. They're not Chinese firms. So I think that China power has to be a little bit qualified from my point of view. But he certainly mentioned, the same way that he mentioned the increase of the European Union. What I'm saying and what I've seen about the trying to see whether these let's say, whether there will be a geographical change in power. I don't see that. For example, we did an exercise in 2017, 2018 in ECLAC, looking at the concentration of firms and whether it has changed in 2011 by type of sector. And yes, China has one or two, but they're in the, let's say, tobacco and things like that. The most sophisticated sectors, the United States, Korea, or Europe are the leading countries. That would be for me. Thanks.
So again, thanks Monica and Esteban for your answers. So we open another round of questions. I remember that you can also write down on the chat. Well, in the meantime, I do have another question. So my issue, my question is the following: why, in the sense, Esteban also mentioned this, mentioned that Celso Furtado was well aware that the Latin American America thinking on economic development, but not only on the economic development in general, was one of the few, if not the only original contribution that came from the periphery. So not from one of the cyclical centers in terms of Prebisch, in terms of this. In terms of Prebisch wars. So my question is: these are something. What's your take on that? Why the Latin American structuralism in general was the only school of thought from the periphery to gain and to become also influential outside the borders of this region?
Can I start with that?
Yeah, please go on.
Okay, I think that all of the Latin American structuralist school of thought is the only one of the commissions created by that time by the United Nations that has this kind of impact in the history of economic thought. And the reason why is, in my view, is the power of the arguments and the density of the discussion that all the work of all the authors that was working at the CLAC at the time got it. So we have a really density of discussion, debates, and also we have by that time what we can see now is that the influence of this corpus of ideas in the political scenario of the time. So the political stage of the time in the 50s was very, very much propense to accept and somehow the ideas that was getting strong inside the institution. So this very thin membrana between the economists from the CLAC and the power of influence of these technicians in the governments of the developmentist governments by the time is an explanation of why this intellectual production somehow became a school of thought later. So, and particularly think about Furtado, in Furtado contribution to the structuralism, because it's not the same we have a lot of common ground between the authors of that time, but it's not the same talking about Prebisch and talking about Furtado and Loyola. So this kind of red brigade inside of the Latin American structuralism of thought is important to highlight. So Furtado, the structuralism that Furtado is cultivating is particular and special in a sense that a lot of commentators highlight. So the long term, and this is Bielszowski talking about the work of Furtado, the long-term, historical long-term perspective. So this is mainly Furtado who is working this kind of work at the clock by the time. The definition of underdevelopment as a process that intensifies and is not easy to get off, and is not the waiting room of the capitalism development as we have seen in the developed countries. So this notion of underdevelopment, we want to Furtado that. And the last thing is the pattern of conspicuous and luxury consumption of our elites, and how this affect the economic structure and our unequal distribution pattern of Latin American societies, and reinforces that. So this kind of the pattern of consumption that is much more related to identity issues is another thing that we want to Furtado in the building of this build of the Latin American structuralist perspective. Thank you.
Thank you, Juliana, for the question. I will qualify a little bit the question. It's not that ECLAC had more the structuralists, or that let's say that group of people had more influence. It was the structuralism, or if you call structuralist to all those thinkers that were writing at the time, it's actually the only effort to think development that came out of what was called then the third world. The only. There's no other thing. And it's certainly some of the issues mentioned by Monica are very important. I think the idea of trying to understand why are these countries backwards, like Furtado says, led him to start thinking about the specificities of Brazil relative to other countries. And I think another factor that is very important is ECLAC. I think, and what the role that ECLAC played. We talk about structuralism, and I've talked to structuralism, but there are a lot of authors that are not very happy with structuralism. Celso Furtado was more happy, but Prebisch was not too happy with that. He said, I don't like to be, caged in one thing, and we call him structuralist. But it was certainly, if you call them, it's a way to refer to this group of people, a certain group of people that happen to work at a certain time in the same institution. But I think it was the effort that was led at the time by thinking the specificities and trying to believe that a regional economic commission could have the role it played at the time that was crucial in trying to articulate that view. And this is why, because it was articulated consciously, that a thinking about development appeared as a coherent whole at that time. And I think that's very important. And I don't think the rest of the regional commissions play that role, and they do not play the role today. Neither the Commission for East Asia or Western Asia or Africa or Europe.
So yeah, thanks again, Monica and Esteban for your answers. So are there other questions? Well, if not, I think, well, we are just in time. We are one hour and a half of this this session has been running for 1 hour and a half. Who happens to be the time schedule of this seminar. So again, I want to thank you, Monica and Esteban, for the really insightful speech and presentation, and also for the answers for the answer. And so again, keep in touch for our next session of the plenary, and in general for the activities of YSI. And thanks for all the participants of the seminar.
Yeah, thank you to everyone, and thank you, Giuliano, for the invitation, and thank you, Monica, for sharing this panel with me.
Thank you, Esteban. Thank you, Giuliano. Thank you all, guys.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Thank you very much. Thank you to everyone. Bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye.